The whispers started the moment Eliza Parker stepped off the dusty stagecoach into Fort Smith, Arkansas, her right leg dragging slightly behind her left as she made her way down the wooden steps. It was the summer of 1872, and the frontier town buzzed with the usual afternoon commerce. But several pairs of eyes turned to watch her uneven gait, lips already curling into poorly concealed sneers. She held her chin high despite the stares, her traveling dress dusty from the 3-week journey from St. Louis. Her dark auburn hair pinned beneath a simple bonnet that had seen better days. Eliza was 22 years old and had come west with nothing but a worn carpetbag, a letter of employment from the Fort Smith schoolhouse, and a heart full of determination that had carried her through worse than curious stares. The limp had been with her since childhood, a gift from scarlet fever that had nearly claimed her life when she was 7. Her right leg had never grown quite as strong as her left, leaving her with a permanent hitch in her step that made walking any distance an exhausting endeavor. But she had learned long ago that pity was worse than mockery, so she accepted neither. The boarding house was 3 blocks from the stagecoach office, and by the time Eliza reached the front steps, her leg ached fiercely and sweat beaded on her forehead despite the late afternoon shade. Behind her, she heard the unmistakable sound of laughter, sharp and cruel. She did not turn around. She had learned that lesson too. Inside the boarding house, Mrs. Caldwell proved to be a round-faced woman with kind eyes and flour dusted on her apron. She showed Eliza to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor, helped her unpack her few belongings, and asked no questions about the limp. That alone made Eliza want to weep with gratitude, though she held the tears back until the door closed and she was finally alone. The school term would not begin for another 2 weeks, which gave Eliza time to familiarize herself with the town and its inhabitants. Fort Smith sat along the Arkansas River, a jumping-off point for those heading into Indian Territory, and it carried all the rough edges and raw energy of a border town. Saloons outnumbered churches 3-1, and the streets turned to mud whenever it rained, which seemed to be every other day that first week. Eliza quickly established a routine. Each morning she would wake early and walk the perimeter of the town, building up her strength and stamina for the days ahead when she would need to stand before a classroom full of children. The walks were slow and deliberate, and more than once she caught sight of townspeople watching her, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disdain. The worst were the young men who loitered outside the saloons, calling out mock sympathy or exaggerated imitations of her gait. She learned to take the long way around to avoid them. It was on one of these morning walks, nearly a week after her arrival, that she first saw him. Eliza had made it to the edge of town where the buildings gave way to dense forest and the road became little more than a dirt trail. She was catching her breath, leaning against a fence post when movement caught her eye. A man emerged from the tree line, leading a pack mule loaded with furs and supplies. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that strained against a buckskin shirt darkened with sweat and wear. His hair was dark brown and hung past his collar, tied back with a strip of leather, and his face was weathered and tanned from years under the sun. But it was his build that struck her most. The way his arms corded with muscle as he adjusted the mule's load, the powerful breadth of his chest, the easy strength in every movement. He looked like he had been carved from the mountains themselves. He noticed her watching and nodded once, a brief acknowledgement before continuing past. Eliza found herself staring after him, something about his quiet presence settling over her like a warm blanket. He had not stared at her leg, had not even glanced down at it. He had simply seen her, nodded, and moved on. She did not see him again for 3 days. The second encounter happened in town, outside the general store. Eliza had spent the better part of an hour selecting supplies for her classroom. Chalk and slate and primers for the students who would not have their own. Her arms were full of wrapped packages, and she was trying to navigate the steps down to the street when her right leg buckled unexpectedly. She stumbled, her packages scattering, and braced herself for the hard impact of the ground. It never came. Strong hands caught her arms, steadying her with a gentleness that seemed incongruous with their obvious power. She looked up into a pair of gray eyes, clear and calm as a mountain stream, and recognized the man from the forest trail. Up close, she could see the faint lines around his eyes, the strong jaw shadowed with several days of beard growth, the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow. "Careful now," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through her. He held her until she regained her footing, then released her and bent to gather her scattered packages without another word. "Thank you," Eliza managed, her face burning with embarrassment. "I lost my balance." "Ground is uneven," he said simply, stacking the packages back into her arms with surprising care. "Easy to trip." He did not mention her leg, did not offer the excessive help that would have implied pity. He simply made sure she had her packages secure, nodded once more, and walked past her into the store. Eliza stood on the wooden walkway for a long moment, her heart beating faster than it should, before she finally made her way back to the boarding house. That evening at supper, she asked Mrs. Caldwell about him. "Oh, that would be Pierce Donovan," the landlady said, ladling stew into Eliza's bowl. "Mountain man. Comes down from the hills every few months to trade his furs and stock up on supplies. Keeps to himself mostly, but he is a good man. Helped rebuild the church after the fire 2 years back. Did not ask for a cent. Strong as an ox and twice as stubborn, or so I hear. Does he live in the mountains year-round? Has a cabin up in the Boston Mountains, about 15 miles north of here. Some folks say he is running from something, others say he just prefers the company of trees to people. Either way, he minds his own business and causes no trouble." Mrs. Caldwell gave her a shrewd look. "Why do you ask? He helped me today," Eliza said quietly. "When I stumbled, did he now?" Mrs. Caldwell's expression softened. "Well, that sounds like Pierce. He has always had a gentle way about him, despite looking like he could wrestle a bear." Eliza said nothing more, but that night she found her thoughts drifting back to those steady gray eyes and the careful way he had handed her packages back to her. The next morning, she saw him again. She had set out on her usual walk, taking the route that led toward the river where the air was cooler and the trees provided shade. The path was narrow and uneven, forcing her to watch her footing carefully. She was so focused on the ground that she did not notice Pierce until she nearly walked into him. He was standing at the edge of the path, examining a tree trunk with intense concentration. When he heard her approach, he looked up, and something that might have been a smile flickered across his face. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," Eliza replied, acutely aware of how breathless she sounded despite having walked less than half a mile. "I did not expect to see anyone out here." "Could say the same," he gestured to the tree. "Bare markings, fresh from last night. You should be careful walking out here alone." Eliza felt a chill despite the warm morning air. "Oh, I did not know." Pierce studied her for a moment, his gaze direct but not unkind. "You are the new schoolteacher. Mrs. Caldwell mentioned you were staying at her place." "Yes, Eliza Parker." She hesitated, then added, "And you are Pierce Donovan, guilty." This time the smile reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. "You planning to walk much further?" "Just to the river and back. I like to walk in the mornings. It helps strengthen my leg." The words came out before she could stop them, and she felt her face flush. She never mentioned her leg to strangers, but Pierce just nodded as if she had commented on the weather. "River is about another mile. I was heading that way myself to check my traps. Mind if I walk with you? Bear might still be around." Eliza's heart gave an unexpected leap. "I would not want to slow you down. I am in no hurry." He adjusted his rifle sling across his broad shoulders and waited, his posture patient and unhurried. They began walking, and almost immediately Eliza noticed something remarkable. Pierce matched his pace to hers exactly. His long strides, which could have eaten up the distance in half the time, shortened to accommodate her slower, uneven gait. He did not walk ahead and wait. He did not offer his arm or hover as if she might fall at any moment. He simply walked beside her, his presence solid and reassuring, as if this were the most natural pace in the world. They did not speak much during that first walk. Pierce pointed out animal tracks and identified bird calls, his knowledge of the wilderness evident in every observation. Eliza found herself relaxing in a way she had not since arriving in Fort Smith, the usual tension that came with navigating public spaces easing with each step. When they reached the river, she sat on a smooth rock to rest her leg while Pierce checked his traps upstream. He returned empty-handed but unconcerned. "Happens sometimes," he said, settling onto a nearby boulder. "The fish know when they are being hunted." "Do you prefer living in the mountains?" Eliza asked, surprising herself with the personal question. Pierce was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "It is peaceful up there, no expectations, no judgments, just you and the land finding a way to coexist." "That sounds wonderful," Eliza said softly. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she felt something shift in the air between them. "It can be lonely too," he admitted, "but lonely is better than being surrounded by people who only see what they want to see." Eliza understood that better than he could know. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." They walked back together, Pierce once again matching her pace without comment. When they reached the edge of town, he tipped his hat to her. "Enjoy the rest of your morning, Miss Parker." "Eliza," she said impulsively. "Please call me Eliza." His smile was slow and genuine. "Eliza." "I am Pierce." "I know," she said, then felt foolish for admitting it. "Mrs. Caldwell told me. She is a good woman, talks a lot, but her heart is in the right place." He shifted his rifle. "I will be in town for another week or so before heading back up the mountain. If you want company on your morning walks, I will be checking those traps most days." It was not quite an invitation and not quite a statement of fact, but something in between that left the choice entirely to her. Eliza found she appreciated that more than any flowery words could have conveyed. "I walk early," she said, "before the sun gets too high. So do I." Pierce nodded once more and then headed toward the trading post, his long strides finally unleashed now that he was alone. Eliza watched him go, something warm and unfamiliar blooming in her chest. The next morning, she woke before dawn and was on the path to the river by the time the first light touched the sky. Pierce was already there, waiting at the spot where they had met the day before. He did not comment on her eagerness or act surprised to see her. He simply fell into step beside her, and they walked together through the awakening forest. This became their routine. Each morning for the next 6 days, they met at the same spot and walked together. Pierce told her about the mountains, about the rhythm of seasons in the high country, about the solitude that could be either a blessing or a curse depending on a man's state of mind. Eliza told him about her childhood in St. Louis, about the scarlet fever that had left her with a permanent reminder of her mortality, about her love of books and learning and the dream of teaching that had brought her west. Pierce never once mentioned her limp, though she knew he noticed it. How could he not? but he simply continued to match his pace to hers, his presence a constant and comforting companion. On the morning of the 6th day, when they reached the river, he surprised her by producing 2 tin cups and a small pot of coffee from his pack. "Figured you might like something hot after the walk," he said, building a small fire with practiced efficiency. They sat by the river drinking coffee as the sun climbed higher, and Eliza realized with a start that she had never felt more at ease with another person in her entire life. Pierce did not fill silence with meaningless chatter, nor did he seem to expect her to perform or present herself as anything other than who she was. With him, she could simply exist, limp and all, and that was enough. "The school term starts soon," she said, watching steam rise from her cup. 2 weeks, Pierce confirmed. "Will you be ready?" "I think so, I hope so." She glanced at him. "Will you be heading back to your cabin soon? Day after tomorrow, need to get back before the summer storms make the trails too muddy." He poured himself more coffee, his movements economical and sure. "I usually stay up there until the first snow, then come back down for winter supplies." "Oh." Eliza tried to keep the disappointment from her voice and failed miserably. Pierce was quiet for a moment, his gray eyes thoughtful. "There is a trading post about 5 miles from my cabin. I stop there every few weeks for mail and news. If you wanted to write, I could check for letters." Eliza's heart leaped. "I would like that very much. Then I will make sure to give you the address before I leave." He met her gaze, his expression serious. "I would like to hear how your teaching goes, and about the town, about you." "I will write," Eliza promised. "Often, if you do not mind." "I would not have offered if I minded." The corner of his mouth quirked up. "Fair warning, though, my spelling is not the best. Did not have much formal schooling." "I am a teacher," Eliza reminded him, her own smile breaking free. "I will overlook any grammatical errors." Pierce laughed then, a rich warm sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest, and Eliza felt something inside her shift and settle, like a key finding the right lock. That afternoon, Pierce came to the boarding house with a carefully written address for the trading post and a promise to check for letters regularly. Mrs. Caldwell watched them from the parlor window, her expression knowing, but she said nothing when Eliza came back inside with flushed cheeks and bright eyes. The next morning was their last walk together before Pierce returned to the mountains. Neither of them acknowledged this fact directly, but there was a weight to their silence that spoke volumes. When they reached the river, Pierce did not build a fire or produce coffee. Instead, he turned to face her fully, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. "Eliza, I need to tell you something before I go." Her heart hammered against her ribs. "What is it?" "I have been coming down to Fort Smith for near about 5 years now. In all that time, I have never looked forward to it. It was just a necessity, a means to an end." He took a breath. "These past few days, walking with you, talking with you, it has been the best part of my year, maybe the best days I have had in a very long time." Eliza felt tears prick at her eyes. "Pierce, let me finish." His voice was gentle but firm. "I know we have not known each other long. I know I am just a mountain man with rough edges and little to offer. But I want you to know that when I am up in those mountains, I am going to be thinking about you, about these walks, about the way you face this town with your head high even when folks are cruel. You are the strongest person I have ever met, Eliza Parker, and that has nothing to do with how you walk and everything to do with who you are." A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. "I do not know what to say." "You do not have to say anything. I just wanted you to know." He reached up and gently brushed the tear away with his thumb, his touch feather light despite his obvious strength. "Write to me. Tell me about your students and your days. Tell me about the books you are reading and the things that make you laugh. I want to know all of it." "I will," Eliza whispered. "And Pierce? These days have been precious to me too, more than I can properly express." He smiled then, soft and genuine, and for a moment she thought he might kiss her. But instead, he took her hand and raised it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that sent warmth flooding through her entire body. "Take care of yourself, Eliza. I will be back before the first snow." They walked back to town in silence, hands occasionally brushing, and when they parted at the edge of the main street, Eliza felt as if a piece of her heart was walking away with him into the mountains. The first few weeks of the school term passed in a blur of activity. Eliza had 12 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and they proved to be as challenging and rewarding as she had hoped. Some could barely read, while others were hungry for knowledge beyond what the small schoolhouse library could provide. She threw herself into teaching with all the passion and dedication she possessed, and slowly the children began to respond. But the walks through town to and from the schoolhouse remained difficult. Without Pierce beside her, the stares and whispers returned with renewed vigor. A group of young men in particular seemed to find endless amusement in her uneven gait, calling out mock offers of assistance or making exaggerated limping motions whenever she passed. Eliza ignored them as best she could, but each incident left her feeling raw and exposed. She wrote to Pierce about her students and her lessons, but she did not mention the mockery. What could he do about it from 15 miles away in the mountains? Better to focus on the positive, on the small victories and the children who were finally starting to believe they could learn. Pierce's first letter arrived 3 weeks after he left, delivered to the boarding house by the mail carrier who serviced the remote trading post. His handwriting was rough but legible, and reading his words felt like having him beside her again. "Eliza, the cabin feels smaller than I remembered. Quieter too. I have been checking the traps and cutting firewood for winter, but my mind keeps wandering back to Fort Smith, to our walks by the river. I hope your teaching is going well and the students are treating you right. There is a fox that has been visiting the cabin each evening. Sits on the porch and watches me like it is trying to figure out what manner of creature I am. Reminds me a bit of how you looked at me that first day by the general store, cautious but curious. I miss talking to you. Miss your laugh and the way you explain things like you are letting me in on a wonderful secret. Write when you can. Tell me everything. Yours, Pierce." Eliza read the letter 3 times before carefully folding it and tucking it into the drawer of her bedside table. That evening she wrote back, filling pages with details about her students and the lessons she was developing. She told him about the fox too, and how she hoped it would keep him company through the long evenings. The letters became a lifeline. Every 2 weeks, like clockwork, a new letter from Pierce would arrive, and Eliza would respond with pages of her own. Through their correspondence, she learned more about the man behind the quiet exterior. He wrote about his childhood on a farm in Missouri, about losing his parents to cholera when he was 17, about drifting west and finding peace in the mountains after years of searching for a place to belong. He wrote about the beauty of the high country, the way the aspens turned gold in autumn, the profound silence of snow falling in the forest. And increasingly, he wrote about missing her, about counting the days until he could come back down to Fort Smith. Eliza's letters grew longer and more personal as well. She wrote about her fears and hopes, about the loneliness she had carried for so long, about how his letters made her feel less alone even when they were miles apart. She still did not mention the continued mockery from the townspeople, but she did write about the satisfaction she found in teaching, in seeing a child's face light up with understanding, in knowing she was making a difference in these young lives. October arrived with cooler temperatures and leaves turning brilliant shades of red and gold. Eliza had been teaching for nearly 2 months, and the schoolhouse had become her sanctuary. The children no longer stared at her leg, and several of the older students had become protective of her, glaring at anyone in town who dared to mock their teacher. It was on a particularly crisp October afternoon that trouble found her. Eliza was walking back from the general store with supplies for the schoolhouse when she encountered the group of young men who had made her life difficult since her arrival. There were 4 of them, all in their early 20s, sons of local businessmen with too much time and too little purpose. Their ringleader was a man named Thomas Grant, whose father owned the largest saloon in Fort Smith. "Well, look who we have here," Thomas called out, stepping into Eliza's path. "The limping schoolmarm. Where are you off to in such a hurry, Miss Parker?" Eliza tried to step around him, but his friends moved to block her way. Her heart began to race, but she kept her voice steady. "Excuse me, please. I need to get back to the boarding house." "You need to get back," Thomas mimicked, exaggerating a limp as he spoke. His friends laughed. "Must be hard, dragging that leg around all day. Does it hurt? Maybe you should just stay inside where folks do not have to watch you hobble about." "Let me pass," Eliza said, her voice harder now. "Or what? You will hit me with that schoolbook." Thomas reached out and knocked the package from her arms, sending her carefully wrapped supplies tumbling into the mud. "Oops. Seems you dropped something. Better pick it up. Oh wait, that might be hard for you." Anger surged through Eliza, hot and bright. She had endured months of this, had held her tongue and maintained her dignity, but something in her snapped. "You are a coward and a bully, Thomas Grant. You mock me because it makes you feel bigger, but all it does is show how small you really are." Thomas's face darkened. "What did you say to me?" "You heard me." Eliza's hands were shaking, but she held her ground. "You are so pathetic that the only way you can feel good about yourself is by mocking a woman for something she cannot control. Your father should be ashamed of the man you have become." She had gone too far, and she knew it. Thomas stepped forward, his expression ugly, and Eliza instinctively stepped back. Her weak leg caught on the edge of the wooden walkway and she stumbled, crying out as pain shot through her knee. She hit the ground hard, mud soaking through her skirts. Thomas loomed over her, and for a terrifying moment, Eliza thought he might actually strike her. But then a shadow fell across them both, and a voice like distant thunder spoke from behind. "Step away from her. Now." Eliza looked up to see Pierce standing there, and her heart nearly stopped. He had appeared as if conjured from her thoughts, but this was not the calm, gentle man she had walked with by the river. This Pierce was terrifying in his anger, his broad shoulders squared, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Every muscle in his powerful frame coiled and ready. His gray eyes were storm dark and fixed on Thomas with an intensity that made the younger man blanch. "This does not concern you, Donovan," Thomas said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "She is on the ground. You are standing over her. That makes it my concern." Pierce took a step forward, and despite being outnumbered 4-1, it was Thomas and his friends who retreated. "I am going to say this once. Apologize to the lady, then get out of my sight before I forget that I am trying to be civilized." Thomas looked at his friends, but found no support there. They were already backing away, apparently deciding that mocking a limping woman was not worth facing down an enraged mountain man who looked like he could break them in half without much effort. "Sorry," Thomas muttered, not meeting Eliza's eyes. "Louder," Pierce growled. "And look at her when you say it." Thomas's face flushed red, but he complied. "I am sorry, Miss Parker, for mocking you and for knocking down your things." Pierce stood there like an avenging angel until Thomas and his friends had hurried away, then immediately dropped to his knees beside Eliza. His expression transformed from fury to concern so quickly it was almost startling. Are you hurt? Did you hit your head? His hands hovered over her, checking for injuries without actually touching her until she gave him permission. I am fine, Eliza managed, though she was shaking violently now. Just my knee and my pride. Let me help you up. Pierce's touch was infinitely gentle as he lifted her from the mud as if she weighed nothing at all. He kept one arm around her waist, supporting her weight, and used the other to gather her scattered supplies. Where are you staying? The boarding house. Eliza nodded, not trusting her voice. Now that the danger had passed, she felt tears threatening, and she did not want to break down in the middle of the street. Pierce seemed to understand. Without another word, he swept her into his arms, cradling her against his chest, and began walking toward the boarding house. Eliza knew she should protest, should insist she could walk on her own, but the truth was her leg hurt abominably, and she felt shaken to her core. So she let herself rest against his broad chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her cheek, and allowed him to carry her home. Mrs. Caldwell took one look at them and immediately ushered them inside and up to Eliza's room, asking no questions but radiating protective concern. Pierce set Eliza gently on her bed, then stepped back as if unsure whether he should stay or go. I will get some hot water and clean cloths, Mrs. Caldwell announced. Pierce, you stay with her until I get back. Make sure she does not go into shock. When they were alone, Pierce pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down heavily. I am sorry I was not here sooner. I came down yesterday, was planning to surprise you this evening. If I had known those men were bothering you. How could you have known? I did not write about it. Eliza wiped at her eyes, frustrated by the tears that would not quite fall. I did not want to worry you when you were so far away. Pierce's jaw tightened. Has it been going on long, the mockery? Since I arrived, it is not just them. Most of the town stares or whispers, but Thomas and his friends were the worst. She met his gaze. I can handle it, Pierce. I have dealt with it my whole life. You should not have to handle it. His voice was rough with suppressed emotion. You should not have to endure that from anyone. But I do, because this is who I am. This is my reality. Eliza reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his fingers as they carefully closed around hers. Your being here, your kindness, it means everything to me, but you cannot fight the whole town. Watch me, Pierce said grimly. Mrs. Caldwell returned with supplies and shooed Pierce out while she helped Eliza clean up and change into dry clothes. The knee was bruised and swollen but not seriously injured, and after applying a cold compress and making Eliza promise to rest, the landlady finally left her alone. Eliza lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the afternoon's events. The fear and anger still churned in her stomach, but underneath it all was the memory of Pierce appearing like her own personal guardian, of being carried in his arms, of the way he had looked at her with such concern and care. He had come back early. He had been planning to surprise her. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Come in, she called, expecting Mrs. Caldwell. It was Pierce. He had cleaned up and changed his shirt, though his hair was still damp as if he had dunked his head in the water basin. He carried a tray with tea and sandwiches, and he looked almost nervous. Mrs. Caldwell said you should eat something, sent me up with this. He set the tray on her bedside table, then hesitated. May I sit with you for a while, please? Eliza said, her heart lifting. Pierce pulled the chair close again and settled into it with a sigh. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Pierce said quietly, I came back early because I could not stay away any longer. Your letters, Eliza, they have been keeping me sane up there. But reading about your life is not the same as being part of it. I wanted to see you, to walk with you again, to just be near you. Eliza's breath caught. Pierce, I know I am just a rough mountain man. I know I do not have much to offer, but these months apart have made me realize something." He leaned forward, his gray eyes intent on hers. "I am falling in love with you, Eliza. Maybe I have been since that first day when you watched me come out of the forest, and I do not want to go back up that mountain without telling you." Tears spilled down Eliza's cheeks, but this time they were happy tears. "I am falling in love with you too. I have been miserable without you. Your letters were wonderful, but they were not enough. I wanted to hear your voice, to see your smile, to walk beside you." Pierce reached out and cupped her face in his large, calloused hand. "I want to court you properly. I want to be here in Fort Smith while you are teaching, to walk you to school every morning and back every evening. I want everyone in this town to know that you have someone looking out for you, and that anyone who mocks or hurts you will answer to me. You would do that. Give up your solitude in the mountains. Eliza, I have spent 5 years hiding in those mountains. Hiding from people, from expectations, from the possibility of being hurt. But you make me want to stop hiding. You make me want to be brave." His thumb brushed away her tears. "I cannot promise I will be good at living in town. I cannot promise I will always say the right thing. But I can promise that I will always match my pace to yours in walking and in life. I will always be beside you for as long as you will have me." Eliza could not speak past the lump in her throat, so she did the only thing she could think of. She reached up and pulled him closer, and when his lips met hers, it felt like coming home. The kiss was gentle and tender, full of promise and hope, and when they finally pulled apart, they were both smiling through tears. "So that is a yes to courting?" Pierce asked, his voice warm with affection. "That is a yes to everything," Eliza whispered. Pierce stayed with her until the evening, sitting beside her bed and telling her stories about the mountains while she ate her supper. He described the cabin he had built with his own hands, the view from his porch that stretched for miles, the creek that ran nearby with water so cold and clear you could drink straight from it. He talked about the wildlife he encountered, the changing seasons, the peace and solitude he had found there. But he also talked about the loneliness, about how the silence that had once been comforting had begun to feel oppressive, about how he had found himself talking to that fox just to hear another voice. "I want you to see it someday," he said. "The cabin, the mountains, all of it. I want to share that part of my life with you." "I would love that," Eliza said, "though the journey might take me longer than most. Then we will take our time. No rush." Pierce stood reluctantly as full darkness fell outside. "I should let you rest. But I will be here tomorrow morning to walk you to school, and every morning after that." He kept his promise. When Eliza came downstairs the next morning, her knee still sore but functional, Pierce was waiting on the front porch. He offered her his arm, and together they walked slowly through town toward the schoolhouse. Eliza was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them, but this time she did not feel vulnerable or exposed. With Pierce beside her, his presence solid and protective, she felt strong. Thomas Grant and his friends were conspicuously absent from their usual lounging spot, and Eliza suspected word had spread about yesterday's confrontation. Pierce's reputation as a mountain man who could handle himself in the wilderness had apparently translated into respect, or at least caution, from the townspeople. At the schoolhouse, Pierce checked the small building thoroughly, making sure everything was secure and safe, before finally preparing to leave. "I will be back this afternoon to walk you home," he said. "You do not have to do that every day," Eliza protested half-heartedly. "I have been managing on my own." "I want to," Pierce said simply. "Besides, it gives me a reason to be in town. Otherwise, I might just head back up the mountain out of habit." He did come back that afternoon, and the next day, and the day after that. A new routine established itself. one that revolved around morning walks to school, afternoons spent doing odd jobs around town or helping the local carpenter with projects, and evenings at the boarding house where Pierce would join Eliza for supper, and they would spend hours talking or reading together in the parlor. The children at school were fascinated by Pierce. He was unlike anyone they had ever encountered, and his knowledge of the wilderness was vast and engaging. When Eliza mentioned this to him, he surprised her by offering to come speak to the class about the natural world. His presentation was such a success that it became a weekly occurrence, with Pierce teaching the children how to identify animal tracks, how to predict weather by observing the sky, how to respect and coexist with the wilderness that surrounded their town. Watching him with the children, seeing how patient and gentle he was with them, despite his intimidating size and rough exterior, made Eliza fall even more deeply in love with him. He never spoke down to the students, never dismissed their questions as silly or unimportant. He treated them with the same respect he showed everyone, and they adored him for it. The weeks passed quickly, autumn deepening into the promise of winter. Pierce had rented a small room above the livery stable, though he spent most of his time at the boarding house with Eliza. They had become an accepted sight in Fort Smith, the schoolteacher and the mountain man, walking together at their own pace, oblivious to the world around them. The mockery had stopped entirely, and even those who had been most cruel now nodded respectfully when they passed. It was in late November, with the first snow beginning to dust the mountains, that Pierce took Eliza on a picnic to their spot by the river. He had packed a basket with food from the boarding house, and they sat on their familiar rocks, bundled in coats and scarves, watching the water flow past. "I have been thinking," Pierce said, his breath misting in the cold air, "about the future, about us." Eliza's heart began to beat faster. "What about us?" "I love you, Eliza. I love you so much it sometimes feels like my chest might burst with it. These past months with you have been the happiest of my life." He took her hands in his eyes serious. "I want to marry you. I want to build a life with you, whether that is here in Fort Smith or up in the mountains or somewhere in between. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to match my pace to yours for the rest of our lives." Tears streamed down Eliza's face, freezing on her cheeks. "Yes, yes, Pierce, I will marry you. Nothing would make me happier." Pierce pulled a simple gold band from his pocket, and Eliza saw that his hands were shaking as he slipped it onto her finger. "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "The only thing I kept from the farm. I have been carrying it with me since I realized I wanted to marry you, waiting for the right moment." Eliza threw her arms around his neck, and he lifted her effortlessly, spinning her in a circle before setting her down and kissing her with a passion that warmed them both despite the cold. When they finally pulled apart, they were both laughing and crying at once. "When?" Eliza asked breathlessly. "When should we marry?" "As soon as you want. Tomorrow, if you are willing." Pierce grinned, looking younger and more carefree than she had ever seen him. "I have already spoken to the minister, and to Mrs. Caldwell, who insisted on helping plan the wedding whether we wanted her to or not." "You were very confident of my answer," Eliza teased. "I was very hopeful," Pierce corrected. "There is a difference." They decided on a December wedding, giving them time to make proper arrangements and for Eliza to finish the fall term at school. Word spread quickly through Fort Smith, and to Eliza's surprise, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Mrs. Caldwell took charge of the preparations with enthusiastic determination, enlisting half the town's women in the effort. Even the children at school were excited, making decorations and practicing a special song to perform at the ceremony. Pierce spent the weeks leading up to the wedding making improvements to his mountain cabin, determined to make it comfortable for Eliza. He added a proper stove for heating, reinforced the walls against winter winds, and built furniture suitable for 2 people instead of 1. He also blazed a new trail from the cabin to the nearest road, one that would be easier for Eliza to navigate with her limp. "We do not have to live up there full time," he assured her when he described his preparations. "We can split our time between the cabin and Fort Smith. Whatever makes you happy." "I want to try living in the mountains," Eliza said. "At least for a while. I want to see your world, to understand the place that shaped you. Besides, I have spent my whole life in towns and cities. Maybe it is time for something different." The wedding took place on a crisp December morning, the church packed with townspeople and students alike. Eliza wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Caldwell had sewn for her, and Pierce wore new clothes that looked uncomfortable on his large frame but that he bore with good grace. When he saw Eliza walking down the aisle on Mrs. Caldwell's arm, his eyes filled with tears, and she knew in that moment that she was making the right choice. They spoke their vows clearly and firmly, promises of love and devotion that felt sacred in their simplicity. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Pierce kissed her with such tenderness that several women in the congregation sighed audibly. The reception that followed was lively and joyful, with food and music and dancing that lasted well into the evening. Late that night, Pierce carried Eliza over the threshold of their room at the boarding house, which would serve as their home until spring, when they would move up to the cabin. He set her down gently, and then just stood there, looking at her with such love that it took her breath away. "I never thought I would have this," he said quietly. "A wife, a future, a reason to hope for tomorrow. You have given me all of that, Eliza. You have given me everything." "You have given me the same," Eliza whispered. "You saw me when others only saw my limp. You walked beside me when others walked past. You loved me for who I am, not despite who I am. That is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." Pierce pulled her close, and they stood there in the lamplight, holding each other, 2 people who had found their perfect match in the most unlikely of circumstances. The winter passed in a blur of happiness. Eliza continued teaching while Pierce took on work around Fort Smith, saving money for supplies they would need when they moved to the cabin. They spent their evenings planning their future, talking about the life they would build together. Pierce taught Eliza everything he knew about living in the wilderness, about hunting and trapping and surviving in harsh conditions. Eliza taught Pierce to read more fluently, and together they devoured books from the schoolhouse library, discovering shared loves of poetry and adventure stories. In February, Eliza realized she was pregnant. She told Pierce on one of their walks to school, and he picked her up and spun her around with such enthusiasm that she had to remind him to be careful of the baby. "A child," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a child." "Are you happy?" Eliza asked, suddenly nervous. Happy does not begin to cover it. Pierce set her down carefully and cupped her face in his hands. "I am terrified and thrilled and more grateful than I can express. You are going to be an amazing mother, Eliza. And I am going to do everything in my power to be a good father." They decided to move to the cabin sooner than originally planned, wanting to be settled before the baby arrived in early autumn. Eliza finished the school term in April, training her replacement carefully and saying tearful goodbyes to her students. Many of them cried, begging her to stay, but she promised to visit and to write letters, and that seemed to comfort them. The journey to the cabin took 2 days, with Pierce leading a pack mule loaded with their possessions, and Eliza riding a gentle mare that he had bought specifically for her. He had been right about the new trail. It was wider and more gradual than the old one, making the trip manageable even for someone with Eliza's limitations. Still, they took frequent breaks and Pierce fussed over her constantly, making sure she was comfortable and not overexerting herself. When they finally arrived at the cabin, Eliza fell in love immediately. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a view of the valley that stretched for miles. The cabin itself was sturdy and well built, with a stone fireplace and real glass windows that Pierce had hauled up from Fort Smith. Inside, she found the furniture he had made, simple but solid and beautiful in its functionality. There was a real bed with a feather mattress, a table and chairs, shelves for books and supplies, and even a rocking chair that Pierce had crafted specifically for nursing the baby. "It is perfect," Eliza breathed, turning in a slow circle. "Pierce, it is absolutely perfect." He looked relieved. "You are sure? It is rough compared to town living, no close neighbors, no conveniences." "It is home," Eliza said simply. "Our home." They settled into mountain life with surprising ease. Pierce had worried that Eliza would find the isolation difficult, but she thrived in the peace and quiet. The cabin became her sanctuary, a place where she could simply be without the constant awareness of being watched or judged. Her limp mattered not at all up here, where the only witnesses were the trees and the wildlife. Pierce taught her to fish and to identify edible plants, to read the signs of changing weather and approaching animals. She proved to be a quick study, her natural intelligence and curiosity serving her well. In turn, she helped him improve the cabin, adding curtains and cushions and small touches that made it feel more like a home and less like a shelter. The summer passed peacefully. They spent long days working on improvements to the cabin and the surrounding land, establishing a vegetable garden and reinforcing the smokehouse. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, talking about everything and nothing, content in each other's company. As Eliza's pregnancy progressed, Pierce became increasingly protective. He insisted on doing all the heavy work, on helping her with tasks that were becoming difficult as her belly grew. He read everything he could find about childbirth, determined to be prepared in case they could not make it to Fort Smith in time when the baby came. In early September, as the aspens were turning gold, Eliza went into labor. Pierce remained calm and steady throughout, guiding her through the contractions, supporting her when the pain became overwhelming. It was a long and difficult labor, made more complicated by their isolation. But after nearly 20 hours, their son was born just as dawn broke over the mountains. Pierce held the baby with a mixture of awe and terror, his large hands cradling the tiny body as if it were made of glass. "He is perfect," he whispered. "Eliza, he is absolutely perfect." They named him Paul Patrick Donovan, and he had his father's gray eyes and his mother's determination. Pierce proved to be a devoted father, rising in the night to help with feedings, spending hours just watching the baby sleep, his expression soft with love. When Paul was 2 months old, they made the journey down to Fort Smith for his christening. The town turned out in force to meet the baby and congratulate the new parents. Eliza's former students, now taught by the new schoolteacher, crowded around to see little Paul, exclaiming over his tiny fingers and toes. Mrs. Caldwell cried happy tears and insisted they stay at the boarding house for a week so she could spoil them all properly. It felt strange to be back in town after months in the mountains, and Eliza found herself missing the solitude and peace of the cabin. She noticed people still stared when she walked, but their expressions were more curious than cruel now, and several women approached her to ask about life in the mountains and to share their own stories of hardship and perseverance. Thomas Grant, the young man who had mocked her so cruelly, approached her in the general store one afternoon. He looked older somehow, more mature and deeply uncomfortable. "Mrs. Donovan," he said formally, "I wanted to apologize properly for my behavior last year. I was cruel and thoughtless, and you did not deserve that treatment. I have thought about it often, and I am ashamed of the man I was." Eliza studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I accept your apology, Thomas. We all make mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them." "I have been trying to," he said quietly. "My father sent me to work on a ranch outside town, said I needed to learn what hard work really means. He was right. I am sorry, Mrs. Donovan, truly sorry." After he left, Pierce put his arm around her shoulders. "That took courage for both of you." "Forgiveness is not about excusing what he did," Eliza said. "It is about not letting his cruelty define my life. I am happy now, truly happy. His apology changes nothing about that, but I hope it helps him become a better person." They returned to the cabin after a week in Fort Smith, all of them relieved to be home. The mountains were dressed in autumn glory, the aspens golden against the dark green of the pines, and Eliza felt her soul settle as they rode up the familiar trail. The years that followed were filled with both challenges and joys. Mountain living was never easy, especially with a young child, but they faced each obstacle together. Pierce continued to trap and hunt, traveling to Fort Smith several times a year to trade his furs and purchase supplies. Eliza created a small school in their cabin, teaching Paul to read and write and appreciate the world around them. When Paul was 3, they had a second child, a daughter they named Emma Rose. She had her mother's auburn hair and her father's adventurous spirit, and she learned to walk on the uneven mountain terrain with the same determination her mother had shown navigating the streets of Fort Smith. Pierce built onto the cabin as their family grew, adding rooms and improvements. He also blazed new trails through the mountains, creating a network that allowed Eliza to explore the wilderness at her own pace. She never moved as quickly as others might, but she discovered that speed was overrated. Moving slowly meant noticing more, appreciating details that others rushed past. It meant teaching her children to observe the world carefully, to respect the rhythms of nature, to understand that different did not mean lesser. Fort Smith remained part of their lives. They visited several times a year, maintaining friendships and connections. Eliza occasionally helped the current school teacher with difficult students or curriculum planning, sharing the expertise she had gained. Pierce helped with construction projects and shared his knowledge of the surrounding wilderness with those brave enough to venture into the mountains. But the cabin was their true home, the place where they were most themselves. It was there that Paul took his first steps, that Emma spoke her first words, that the Donovan family built a life defined by love and mutual respect, rather than by society's expectations or limitations. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Pierce took Eliza back to their spot by the river near Fort Smith. The children were staying with Mrs. Caldwell, giving them a rare evening alone. They sat on the same rocks where Pierce had proposed, watching the water flow past just as it had a decade before. "Do you ever regret it?" Pierce asked quietly. "Giving up teaching to live in the mountains with a rough man like me?" Eliza looked at him in surprise. "Never, not for a single moment. Why would you think I might? You had a calling. You were a wonderful teacher. Sometimes I wonder if I was selfish, asking you to leave that behind." "Pierce Donovan, look at me." Eliza waited until his gray eyes met hers. "You gave me everything I ever wanted, things I did not even know I wanted until I found them with you. A home where I am valued for who I am, not judged for how I walk. Children who are growing up knowing that different is not wrong, that limitations are just opportunities to find new paths. A partner who has matched his pace to mine in every way that matters. I have no regrets." None. Pierce pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. I love you, Eliza, more now than the day we married, if that is even possible. It is possible, she said softly, because I feel the same way. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of Fort Smith settling in for the evening, but it felt far away, like it belonged to a different world. Their world was the mountains and each other, and that was more than enough. As they grew older, Pierce and Eliza watched their children grow into remarkable adults. Paul became a wilderness guide, leading groups through the mountains with the same patience and knowledge his father had shown him. He married a kind woman from Fort Smith, a doctor's daughter who adapted to mountain life with grace and enthusiasm. Emma became a teacher like her mother, but she taught in a traveling school, moving between remote mountain communities and bringing education to children who otherwise would have none. She married a fellow teacher, and together they made a difference in countless young lives. Pierce and Eliza became grandparents, delighting in the next generation of Donovans. They split their time between the cabin and a small house they purchased in Fort Smith, wanting to be close to their growing family while maintaining the solitude they both cherished. Pierce's hair turned silver and his movements slowed slightly, but he remained strong and vital well into his 60s. Eliza's limp became more pronounced with age, but it bothered her less than ever. She had spent a lifetime proving that how she walked had nothing to do with her worth as a person. On a crisp autumn morning 35 years after that first meeting on the forest trail, Pierce and Eliza took one final walk together. They were both in their 70s now, their hair silver, their bodies bearing the marks of a life well lived. Pierce's pace had slowed considerably with age, but he still matched it carefully to Eliza's, just as he had always done. They walked to their favorite spot by the river, moving slowly, taking frequent breaks. When they reached their rocks, they sat together, Pierce's arm around Eliza's shoulders, her head resting against his chest. You remember the first time we walked this path together? Eliza asked. When you told me about the bear markings. I remember thinking you were the bravest person I had ever met, Pierce said. Walking out here alone despite your leg, despite being new to town, I wanted to know you better. I wanted to know everything about you. And now you do, Eliza said with a smile. Every secret, every fear, every dream. And I love every single part. Pierce pressed a kiss to her silver hair. Thank you, Eliza, for saying yes all those years ago, for building this life with me, for teaching me that love is not about finding someone perfect, it is about finding someone perfect for you. You did the same for me, Eliza whispered. You saw me when I felt invisible. You walked beside me when others walked past. You loved me exactly as I am, and that changed everything. They sat there as the sun climbed higher, warming the earth, bringing light to the shadows. Around them, the forest hummed with life. The river flowed endlessly toward the sea, and two souls who had found each other against all odds rested in the peace of knowing they had lived a life full of purpose, passion, and unwavering love. In the years that followed, the story of the schoolteacher and the mountain man became something of a legend in Fort Smith. Parents told their children about the woman who refused to let her limp define her, and the man who loved her enough to slow his pace to match hers. Teachers used their story to talk about the importance of kindness and seeing past surface differences. Young couples facing their own challenges would visit the spot by the river and leave flowers, hoping some of that enduring love would bless their own relationships. When Pierce passed away at the age of 78, peacefully in his sleep with Eliza beside him, the town of Fort Smith mourned. His funeral was attended by hundreds, including mountain men who had known him, families he had helped over the years, and children he had taught about the wilderness. They buried him on a hillside overlooking the valley he had loved, with a view of both the mountains and the town. Eliza lived for another 5 years, spending her time surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She never remarried, though she had offers. How could she, when she had already spent a lifetime with her perfect match? She wrote down their story, filling journals with memories and lessons learned, wanting future generations to understand what they had built together. On her final day, surrounded by family in the house they had shared in Fort Smith, Eliza smiled and spoke her last words clearly. "I am coming, Pierce. Wait for me at the river." They buried her beside her husband, and on the shared headstone, their children had inscribed simple words that captured the essence of their love. Pierce and Eliza Donovan. He matched his pace to hers, always together, forever. The cabin in the mountains became a family retreat, maintained by their descendants and used by each new generation. Inside, on a shelf above the fireplace, sat the journals Eliza had written, a testament to a love that had overcome mockery and hardship to create something beautiful and lasting. And in Fort Smith, the path to the river where they had walked together so many times became known as Donovan's Trail. Young couples still walked it, moving slowly, taking time to appreciate the journey rather than racing to the destination. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when the mist rose from the water, people swore they could see two figures walking together beside the river, their pace perfectly matched, their love eternal. The story of Pierce and Eliza Donovan taught generations that true love is not about grand gestures or perfect circumstances. It is about seeing someone for who they truly are and choosing to walk beside them through whatever life brings. It is about matching your pace to theirs, not just in walking but in all the rhythms of life, creating harmony from differences, and building something stronger together than either could have managed alone. Their legacy lived on in their children and grandchildren, in the students Eliza had taught, and the people Pierce had helped, in every person who learned from their example that different is not less, that limitations can be overcome, and that the greatest strength lies not in how fast you can move but in choosing to move together, supporting each other every step of the way. In the end, theirs was a love story for the ages, set against the backdrop of the Wild West but timeless in its message. They had found each other in a world that could be cruel and unforgiving, had built a life together based on mutual respect and unwavering devotion, and had proven that the deepest love is the kind that sees you completely and loves you not despite your imperfections, but because they make you who you are. Pierce had slowed his pace to match Eliza's always, and in doing so, he had taught her that she had never needed to rush to keep up with anyone. She was exactly where she needed to be, moving at exactly the right speed, and she was worthy of someone who understood that. Together, they had walked their path, created their story, and left behind a legacy of love that would inspire others for generations to come. And somewhere, in the golden aspens and clear mountain streams, in the quiet solitude of wilderness and the bustling life of frontier towns, the spirit of their love endured, a reminder that the best things in life are worth slowing down for, that true partnership means meeting each other where you are, and that love, real love, is patient, kind, and willing to match its pace to yours, always and forever.